Hello and welcome to this Bristol Ideas online event in partnership with the Arts and Humanities Research Council and BBC Radio 3's New Generation Thinkers. My name is Zoe Stedman-Milne and I'm the creative content producer for Bristol Ideas. Every year, Radio 3 and the AHRC hold a nationwide search for the best new arts and humanities academics with ideas that will resonate with a wider audience. These new generation thinkers represent some of the brightest early career researchers in the country. Their research has the potential to redefine our understanding of an array of topics from history to the way we speak. And this is something that we at Bristol Ideas are obviously always very keen to get involved in. Today, I'm joined by two of the current New Generation Thinkers cohort to discuss the concept of long-termism. So joining us today, we've got Dr. Kerry McInerney, and she's a research associate at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence, where she researches AI from the perspective of gender studies, critical race theory, and Asian diaspora studies. She has recently edited an anthology for Bloomsbury, The Good Robot, Why Technology Needs Feminism, which is available from all good bookshops, and is the co-host of the Good Robot podcast on feminism and technology. And we'll include links for all of those in the description below. Joining us also is Dr. Dan Taylor, a lecturer in social and political thought at the Open University and a researcher in contemporary political theory and the history of political thought. Prior to joining the Open University, he taught at Goldsmiths, University of London, Lawrence University, the Mary Ward Centre, and the University of Roehampton. And before doing all of that and being an academic, he worked in frontline community, disability, mental health, and homelessness charities across London. So just a lot packed into, but what I'm going to say is a very short career, Dan. His latest book, Spinoza and the Politics of Freedom, is published by Edinburgh University Press. And again, we'll put links in the description where you can find out about both our speakers, their work and their books. So Kerry and Dan, welcome.
Thank you so much for having us here. It's really delightful to get to be in conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Zoe. Yeah, I'm excited.
Great. So the topic today is long-termism, and it's something at Bristol Ideas that we've been exploring through various talks and events and festivals for at least the last decade. And I think we'll start off with sort of explaining, or at least deciding amongst ourselves, what the term actually means. Possibly, and again, with Dan and the philosophy background, this could be a never-ending topic. But I suppose in its simplest form, the way that we like to think about it, and I'm sort of doing the quoting bit here, so it's described as the ethical view that positively influencing the long term is a key moral priority of our time. And here at Bristol Ideas, we sometimes think of that concept as being a good ancestor. So I thought maybe a good place to start. Kerry, how do you think about long-termism?
Yes, I mean, I think that description really captures a lot of what's really key to long-termism for me, which is it's about a certain kind of temporal mindset or set of parameters. So saying rather than subscribing to this particular idea of like individual self-interest, the world is for me and for my benefit, saying that actually we need to curate and create a future that is going to be good and habitable for future descendants and future peoples. Of course, there's a lot of critics of the idea of long-termism as well, which I think we're definitely going to be talking about today. But I think that definition is a really helpful starting point.
Dan, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, so Zoe, I think that's more or less a quote, isn't it, from William McCaskill, whose thought on this has been fundamental for thinking about long-termism. And I think there's a lot that we'll get into within that, even within that short phrase, is long-termism as a key moral priority, not the key moral priority, but certainly a moral priority. And I think it's a fantastic way of trying to think about our obligations or our hopes, fears about the future in a way that becomes freed of the moral baggage, which perhaps progressive movements have been over the last 150, 200 years. So I think it's very interesting, but I think there's going to be a lot that we'll need to untangle about who and how we make claims to the future and how we can, even in the way that William McCaskill approaches it, how we can do it in a way that involves morality or is freed of morality. Because in a lot of ways, the future is so intangible, and a lot of it comes back to the imagination. So I think me and Kerry are going to really sort of dig into that as we go along.
Definitely. I think moral is something that we've sort of thought a lot about again, I think, over the years, this idea of morality, where it comes from, and who is the sort of the arbiter of morality. I think that's an interesting one as well. So Let's talk a little bit more about your individual areas of research. So I thought we could just sort of do a very brief sort of overview of essentially what your work involves and how it relates to long-termism. And again, we're gonna start off with you, Kerry.
Of course, and Dan, your reflections sound fascinating. I can't wait to dive into them more. So yes, I research the ethics of artificial intelligence, which has gone from being a smaller niche field to suddenly being on the news all the time, which has been very disconcerting. And so long-termism has been a really central part of this research, because what we're often thinking about is our futures with technology. So thinking about not only what kinds of harms are happening with the deployment of AI right now, but also how could these new technologies profoundly shape the futures ahead of us, whether that's to do with the climate crisis that could be exacerbated by AI, through to the changes in labor conditions, the automation of work, also through to the deployment of AI for military purposes and for other kinds of purposes of violence and control. And so these kinds of long-term questions are really important. And so, though, what's quite interesting, though, is within the AI ethics community, this long-termist framing has itself been quite controversial. So there's become increasingly a divide between different communities of AI ethicists and AI safety thinkers, between those who say, actually, one of our key priorities has to be thinking about the long-term impact of AI, and others who are saying, no, actually, what's really important is that we think about the grounded impact AI is having now. And to some extent, I think this division is absolutely a false dichotomy. I think most people who you talk to who think a lot about the effects of AI are deeply concerned with both its short, medium, and long-term effects. So I think that to some extent creating kind of polarization when it comes to thinking about what AI's risks and harms are is, actively distracting, and it doesn't actually help us grapple with the meaningful issues that we're facing to do with AI right now. At the same time, though, I think that there's good reasons to be skeptical of some kinds or strands of long-termist thinking when it comes to AI ethics. So we can definitely discuss this in more detail during our conversation. A couple I want to throw out there is, the first is sort of who's leading this conversation around AI and its long-term risks. So for example, I think often we see leaders in big tech. So I think, for example, the leaders of firms like OpenAI, or think Elon Musk with Twitter/X, are often the ones talking about, we really need to be concerned about these long-term existential threats posed by AI. And there's something quite ironic about that, because these are the people who are actually dictating the shape that these future technologies take in many ways. And yet they often treat tech development as though it's something somehow external to them. And there's often a fundamental hypocrisy between the language of long-term risk that they deploy and what they may be doing behind the scenes. So for example, Sam Altman with OpenAI has been a huge advocate for thinking about AI's existential risks, particularly the risks posed by large language models like ChatGPT. But behind the scenes, OpenAI has been lobbying explicitly for weaker regulatory measures. And so I think there's a little bit of a disjunction there between, the language of long-term risk and sort of having a debt to the future, to be a good ancestor, to use your word, Zoe, and maybe what we're doing in the present. And the second concern I have, and this is where I'd be really interested to hear Dan's reflections, is this idea of whose future? Because I actually helped co-run a research group that I really loved called Futures in Question, which was specifically grappling with how different disciplines and fields imagine the future and what kinds of anticipatory future thinking are they involved in. So this was everything from sort of thinking about biodiverse futures to abolitionist thinking through to AI, of course, and thinking through these different kinds of potential futures. And I think something that comes up time and time again is the way that historically some strands of long-termist thinking have claimed to be acting on behalf of all humanity, but haven't really delved into sort of what that means. And so I think a particularly difficult example of this is the way that often different people's experience of sort of world-ending violence or apocalyptic violence has not really been built into these ideas of existential risk or into this long-termist vision. So there's a fantastic scholar called Grace Dillon who coined the term indigenous futurisms and also does a lot of work on indigenous science fiction. And something that she emphasizes in her work is the way that a lot of indigenous science fiction is grappling very meaningfully with these lived experiences of existential death and of apocalypse, because they've already had to live through that. And I think our long-termist thinking would be much more impactful, much richer, if there was a greater awareness of how many of the fears I think that long-termist theorists have about the future have already happened to a lot of people. So I'm going to leave that there because I really want to hear Dan's reflections. But yeah, just to kind of emphasize that long-termism can sound like this very abstract philosophical concept. And again, I love philosophy. I'm a big nerd. That's why I'm here. But it's also something that's really grounded in a lot of tech practice and actively shaping kind of our regulatory and our policy related, priorities.
Thank you, Kerry. And regulation, actually, that's something, again, we've been talking about and thinking about a lot. We run a festival of economics, and regulation of looking at sort of tech companies is something that we've had discussions about in sort of a lot of the recent festivals. Dan, let's come to you. I think it would be really interesting to hear. Obviously, you don't feel like you have to reflect on Kerry's too much. I think we'd love to hear about your work first, and then we can have a bit more of a discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Kerry. Kerry, as you were talking, it really made me think that often what underpins these long-termist visions is a sense that we can have strength and security and power over the future, which involves a kind of mastery or attempt at domination. And I didn't connect these two things until you started talking, which is a point that's made about what sometimes called the scientific revolution in early modern Europe 400 years ago, associated with the Royal Society, Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton. And there's a term that's sometimes used called Prometheanism, after Prometheus, the thief of fire. And that what you got with Francis Bacon, this key English scientist and philosopher, pioneer of the experimental method, is he said that human beings have a right to do violence and to torture nature in order to reveal its secrets. And it's a really curious comment, because one of Francis Bacon's jobs was he served the monarch of the day. I think it's Elizabeth I. Hopefully my history teacher brain is still buried in there somewhere. And he was involved in torturing heretics, but he said, we should torture nature to reveal its secrets. What you get in Descartes, another thinker, is this idea that this vision that everything except humans don't have souls, and he talks about animals as things that we have the right to kind of torture and experiment on. Now, how all of this connects, Kerry, what you're saying, is that sometimes when people make claims about the future, they're claims of mastery or strength, but they also open up, on the one hand, questions of perspective and standpoint. Who gets to make these claims of mastery and domination? And I think this is what we'll really get into in our conversation. But I think they also distract from our fragility or vulnerability as human beings. And this is where I was going to come in with my intervention at the start. So when I think about long-termism, obviously it's something that when we think about shaping the future and our strength in the future, but I think it's actually two ways. I think our sense of the long term comes from looking ahead and also looking backwards. It reminds me of the Roman god Janus, who could two faces forwards and backwards. And I'll give you an anecdote to sort of draw on this sense of fragility, which is where I want to begin, which is a couple of years ago, after the COVID-19 lockdowns, I took my then 3-year-old son to go and see my grandma. And we hadn't been able to meet each other in person for a couple of years. My gran hadn't seen my son for quite a long time. And it was a very interesting, quite powerful moment for me, because on the one hand, my son, at the age of 3, speaking is kind of his self is kind of coming into being. And when with parenting or any form of kind of care of young people, it suddenly opens up these questions that you hadn't really considered about your sense of stewardship for their future, because children are often like sponges. They absorb good and bad. And that's quite a worrying concern. It raises questions about what kind of world you'll pass on to them. And I'm implicitly inviting these ideas of stewardship and generations, which I think are key to long-termist tradition. But then on the other hand, we were meeting my grandma then losing her eyesight and losing her memory. And it was quite a powerful and upsetting moment for me, because we all know this when with elders, when with early onset dementia or Alzheimer's, is that their grasp of the short term disappears and then the grasp of the long term disappears. It's almost like a photographic film that's been overexposed. Suddenly what were clear images become kind of grayer and grayer and whiter and whiter. And my grandma was kind of mixing up me with my deceased uncle and others. And the son in this was sort of just trying to get across who he was. And in that kind of painful moment, why I want to kind of bring this up with the long term, is this sense that on the one hand, you have this tradition of making strong claims and strong visions about the future and what we're going to do. And one form of technology 100 years ago, 400 years ago, is going to make us more powerful and more strong. Against that, we have the fragility of human lives, the sense of nurture and dependency that we're always in. And we have the final point I want to sort of pull out of that anecdote, which is I always look to my gran as a kind of, I don't know, as a kind of repository of memory, that whatever happened, my gran would keep us all safe and she would know everything. And in a way, it's that moment kind of messed up. It confused my sense of the future, because suddenly I thought, well, hold on a minute. If my granny's struggling to remember a lot of things that we kind of knew and exchanged, it's now, in a way that I never really expected, kind of falling on me. I always felt like I was the child that was waiting to grow up. And now I'm the one, and there's the child. And we have this world that my son will live in and I'll live in that is kind of has these deep structural and social problems that I don't really know how to solve. And that's where I want to begin with the long term, because it involves a connection with future and with past. It's something that's fragile. And also when we try and imagine the future, just as in the same ways that we try and imagine memory, in the ways in which someone who's losing their memory often invents details and kind of relies on probability, the future always involves imagining. It involves a kind of shared imagining sometimes. In the political progressive tradition, the great visionaries, the great imaginaries, set out a future and try and they reconstruct elements of the present, and they use it to kind of inspire, but usually warn. So when often in our tradition, our traditions of future visioning or long-termism are the utopian and dystopian traditions. And although originally the utopian tradition with Thomas More is about a different place rather than a place in the future, what you get certainly in time of George Orwell or Aldous Huxley, the great dystopias, so the classic golden era of dystopias, or Margaret Atwood, are worlds that are kind of in the future, but also a reflection and a kind of composition and mashup of the present. Now that kind of fragility in imagining is useful, because when I kind of invoke this idea of parenting or being a grandchild, in some ways it's bringing up this sense that we live in a kind of among a series of continuous generations, for better or worse. And what you get in William McCaskill's work, which Zoe kind of quoted at the beginning, what we owe the future, is this very powerful thought experiment in the beginning of the book. And he says, well, what if we're not about to face apocalypse, climate produced apocalypse, climate crisis apocalypse? What if instead we are the ancients? And actually, if we look at the average lifespan of any mammal species, then it's very likely that we're going to live for many more, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years in the future. And so everything that we do now has a massive bearing on the almost the trillions of generations that are lying ahead. And I think that's a powerful image. When we think about generations, forwards and backwards, in one sense, it ties into the veneration of ancestors that you get in different religions, and also that we see in earlier beliefs, say, even if you're going to look at the Druids in England or whatever, but also ties into the 20th century progressive movements, those that are involved in the foundation of the welfare state in the UK, which had this idea of creating a better world for our children or for our grandchildren. And this image is always brought up. Now, in case this all seems kind of disquieting, because really, if you kind of get a philosopher on the panel, they're meant to come up with something that's even kind of something kind of politically and morally exciting. I find the future kind of more concerning, and that's why I want to kind of bring in these questions of standpoint. I'm going to make one more point, and then I'm going to hand back to Kerry. And that's a quote that I really like, but I'm actually going to critique it from William Morris, great wallpaper designer, but also philosopher, and political activist of the 19th century. He wrote a book called News from Nowhere, which is his kind of vision of the future. It's a long-termist vision. It's very much inspired by the ideas of John Ruskin, which is that work, labour should be beautiful. We shouldn't be all living in back-to-back slum terraces, but we should all be kind of creating beautiful works and living in a world without work. And it's a very fantastic vision. In News from Nowhere, the character goes to the British Museum, I think it's set in 100, 150 years' time. And it's all about imagining this world that could be. I mean, I think it's 1899, I'm not sure. Someone on this might say, come on, the year is this. But it's a late 19th century vision. It's very different to the world that we live in. Now, William Morris has this wonderful line. He says, if others can see it as I've seen it, then it may be called a vision rather than a dream. And I think what William Morris, like many people, try and do with a utopia or a long-termist vision, like William McCaskill and all those people in the future, is a way of using the imagination, reconstructing images of the present in order to kind of give us something that we can kind of collectively dream in. And what makes those dreams important is that they give us a sense of hope. And hope gives us a sense of agency, that our actions have consequences that are useful in steering. And I think that, in the last place, is what makes long-termism so important and relevant, but also tricky, because we can easily get caught up in other people's dreams. And there are all these questions of power, domination, and standpoint that I think we must come back to, and I think Kerry brought up very well. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, of course. And I think the stories you tell are really illuminating, really beautiful. I mean, I think this dynamic between mastery and vulnerability is something I find really fascinating around technology and our particular aspirations when it comes to our technological futures in two ways. I think it's vulnerability, I think about as both kind of this really interesting insight or principle from feminist theories of technology, saying that rather than thinking about technologies as something we use to control or dominate our environment, something which is an extension of our kind of rational, liberal individual selves, like we've always been co-joined with technologies in different ways. And like our understanding of the world could be very different if we also reshaped our relationship with technology. So Ursula Le Guin, the famous kind of feminist science fiction writer, but also essayist, has a beautiful essay called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, where she talks about, this carrier bag theory of evolution. So saying if we thought about the history of evolution not through the sword or the stick or trying to think about, the evolution of humanity through the use of weaponry, but instead thought about it through the carrier bag, or the idea that the first tool was probably not a stick or not a weapon or a sword, but was a vessel used for carrying things. Like, how would that change our understanding of what it meant to be human? How would that include so many more people and lay the groundwork for different kinds of relationality, not based on these kinds of dominance and submission relations? And so I think I find that really helpful when it comes to thinking about vulnerability and our long-term relationships with technology. But I also think that the points you make around mastery are really interesting around this idea of control and like needing to control the future, because one of the most insidious things I think about the way that the tech industry deploys the language of long-termism is that all of the futures they describe say it might involve AI used safely, or AI with appropriate guardrails, or AI used in ways that hopefully maybe respect human rights. But they never talk about a future where AI just doesn't exist. And I think that's actually a really important part of our ethical considerations of AI is, do we even want these technologies at all? Like, what happens if we just say, actually, no, we think that overall these technologies are not going to help us be good ancestors. They're actually going to fundamentally undermine the rights and the life and happiness potentially of future generations. So let's just get rid of them. And Brian Merchant actually has a new book called Blood in the Machine, which traces the Luddite Revolution in the UK. And argues that even though Luddite is a term that's often used to kind of suggest, oh, you're anti-technology, or you don't know how to use Zoom, or that's directed at me because I always forget to unmute myself. The Luddites, he argues, like weren't anti-technology, but they were profoundly anti the devastating social and political effects that industrialization was having on their societies. And that's what they were challenging. And there's a really important sort of germ of an idea, I think, there, or a really important inspirational moment for us to think about how we relate to big tech and the claims they make about the way tech is supposedly an inevitable part of our future.
I think that's a really good point about the inevitability, actually, that idea that just because we're on a certain sort of trajectory, we can't get off it. Dan, I think one of the things that's always quite interesting, I think, is that idea of looking back and trying to learn from history, from mistakes. And it's surprising that that's one lesson that humanity still hasn't quite grasped.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that there's this sense, Kerry put it across so well, that when we kind of hear the prognostications of Elon Musk and others, that this technological progress is somehow inevitable, and there's nothing we can do about it because it's being dictated by the technology. And this completely sidetracks from questions of power, which I think, Kerry, you were getting at, that who are the powerful people here, who is in control of this technology? Because it seems like the technology is kind of leading the way and there's nothing we can do. Then in a way that encourages a kind of fatalism, or maybe even like a learned helplessness. And I think that can be quite worrying, to surrender, well, not so much power, but I think when we're thinking about something like the future, or even the past, our sense of agency, our capacity to act, our power to act. And I was thinking, Kerry, when you said the brilliant point a moment ago, well, what if we were to get rid of AI as well? What if kind of let it develop, but kind of, I don't know what's that put it. I'm imagining it almost being like radioactive waste or something that you use to kind of produce nuclear power, but you've got to bury it in the sea afterwards. You can create it can be immensely socially and economically useful, but you kind of have strict limits on its use. I was thinking then, one of the things that I noticed in this conversation about AI, or even other well, enough one. Well, this again, it comes up in William McCaskill. Climate change, climate crisis, AI, and climate crisis are these two things. They're almost like they're two immensely powerful frames that have really appeared in our view socially, or I guess like in British media and culture in the last, I don't know, 5, 10, well, AI in the last 1 or 2 years. Kerry, I feel like for better or worse, it's a real growth time for you. But with climate crisis, as much as people have been talking about, fearing about it for 40, 50 years, if not longer, it's really in the last sort of 10 years or 8 years, maybe 6 years, that it's kind of appeared on our cognitive maps. Now, with both of these frames, there's a kind of sense of these are disasters in the future, and now it's kind of too late for us. And I think that's really interesting. I've noticed that, obviously, both me and Kerry both work in universities. This AI is kind of really screwing up assessments, to put it frankly, and creating difficult questions about what it means to be the author of human work. And so I want to come back to that point, Kerry, and ask you a bit about it. So climate change is one thing, AI is another. If we sort of stay on AI, it seems that there's a kind of perception that there's nothing that we can do. And it seems from the comment that you made earlier that actually we're almost giving into the tech bros kind of vision that, we can't do anything about it, let them roll on with it. But I mean, thinking about your work with when you get in whose future and all those different interdisciplinary approaches, do you see some bases or some ways in which the people or different forms of social subjects can try and assert power, try and control or restrict AI? Because at the moment, it seems like a free-for-all, and that's scary. It seems like we're just waiting for Google's Gemini or ChatGPT-5 to come along and just make us all obsolete, so that in a few years' time, if there's a panel like this, we'll all be holograms, generated by a program. Kerry, have you come across ways in which people are talking about ways in which we can take power back?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. And it's one that I feel like my answer really varies depending on how optimistic or pessimistic I'm feeling in relation to the universe on a day. But really genuinely, I think that there are things that we can do. And I already mentioned the what happens if we just say no paradigm. I think that's really important. At the same time, I myself am not profoundly anti-AI. I think there's a lot of really useful applications that I myself use. So in terms of thinking about what can we do, something I like to encourage people to do is say, actually, we have a history of some real successes when it comes to pushing back against particular kinds of tech use. So if we think about the kind of wide-scale bans in a lot of cities on the use of facial recognition software, for example. So a lot of my work really focuses on trying to spread a lot of awareness about the fact that there are a lot of technologies that we can and should resist on the basis that they are just, based on completely faulty logic. So a lot of my work looks at recruitment software, and particularly how a lot of those kinds of software packages reproduce certain kinds of phrenological or scientifically racist ideas about personality. And so what we do see is forms of subtle resistance. So things like gaming the system. So candidates finding ways to exploit AI systems. But then also kind of more overt forms of resistance. So just opting out of a procedure, saying, I refuse to be processed by AI, forms of regulation. And I really think that there is capacity in space to kind of be pushing back. And so that's where I'm very, even though I am myself often quite a cosmic pessimist, and I look a lot of the really nefarious applications of these technologies, I also think it's quite important to avoid this kind of overwhelming techno-pessimism. And that's why, despite my negativity, I co-run a podcast with Dr. Eleanor Drage called The Good Robot. And the central question of that podcast is, what is good technology? Is it even possible? So, leaving this kind of opening so people can still just say no. And then how can feminism help us work towards it? And people's answers there wildly vary. And I really love getting the opportunity to hear them reflect on, the kinds of technologies I see as good, from the knitting needle through to the recipe book, as a way of reframing how we personally engage with new technologies and old technologies, but also how we can say no or resist the ones that we think are actually quite damaging and unhelpful. I don't know if that really answered your question.
No, I think that's really helpful, and you've given a few lines of inquiry there to sort of help us think about I guess power, so like democratic power or collective power. When you talked about the Luddites and Luddism earlier, and then these different ways in which people kind of resist and kind of withdraw, it made me think. I was thinking back to the 90s session, and Zoe, you sort of invited this comment earlier, thinking about the past with this. that I suppose with I don't know what the spinning jenny or these kind of the steam engine or these kind of technologies, which in some ways are probably more socially disruptive than AI is. I mean, I hope that's not an awful thing to say. I think they probably were back then. Technologies that completely de-skilled, a lot of skilled trades, and that meant that a lot of workers, men and women, children back then were the work that was now available would have been paid much less. It didn't have the same skill, and often it's on these kind of dangerous machines for long hours. In the 19th century, there was a governing ideology in the UK of laissez-faire, and laissez-faire economics, which kind of sort of literally means like let it be. This kind of ideology, on one hand, it kind of enabled the flourishing of British free trade capitalism and kind of what that meant in terms of economic control of most of the rest of the world. Conservatives might say, well, this is what enabled people to sort of fund new technologies and enable a social progress. I would be very critical of that. I think when you think about laissez-faire economics, it's indistinct from things like the famine in Ireland in the mid-19th century, in which there was a kind of reliance that economic logics and technology should be sort of allowed without too much government control, because then that way it can really innovate and prosper. What I'm getting to is the risks when we think about technologies or economic powers sort of being allowed to kind of grow without social restriction, which I think is what you were getting at. And I started to think, okay, right, you had those men, women, and children, doing kind of working class men, women, and children, often doing increasingly dangerous and difficult work in the 19th century. But it changed substantially by the 20th century, not because the governments of the day kind of thought, oh, you know what, we really shouldn't have children, small boys working in coal mines. Or we shouldn't have, young women kind of losing their eyesight and their jaws kind of degrading because they work in match factories. It was workers organising and fighting and resisting, I think, in the ways that you're getting at, which enabled this kind of claim that actually the technology or economics shouldn't just be allowed to grow its own logic. We need enough of value. And this is maybe what I was thinking at the very beginning, the William McCaskill line, a key moral priority. I think whenever we think about new technologies or economics, we have to remember morality, and morality is also instinct from politics. Now, when we think about the impact of AI, there's a lot of great theory about it. One of the things that I think is missing, I don't think it's missing from the conversation, it's there, but it's not the loudest voice in the room, is about forms of democratic and social control of technology, so that these things can be harnessed in ways that almost create a sovereign wealth fund for people now and in the future. And so that they can be harnessed so that all of us can reach up to a minimum kind of standard of living, probably higher than what it is for many people at the present in the UK and around the world. And then so that it ultimately serves us to work less, which was always the kind of the fantasy or vision in the early 20th century or the 19th, that people in the future wouldn't work as much. John Maynard Keynes, the grandchildren of the future would work, whatever it was, 10 hours a week or something. So I think when Kerry, the things that you brought up really kind of highlights the importance of politics in this. Maybe that's something that we're not getting enough at the moment. I think that's why it's really interesting what you've set out to do by bringing different disciplines and also try and call out the hypocrisy. Maybe sort of throw it back in as a kind of conversational basketball, if I kind of chuck it over to you. Kerry, you've done a lot of work approaching this using feminist ethics. I wonder if there's any specific findings or specific contributions that you would direct, within these debates around power, domination, control, fragility.
Oh, I love that question. I actually want to very quickly, sorry, to just bounce the basketball straight back. I was going to say, I just want to quickly comment about kind of the importance of paying attention to this laissez-faire ideology at the time, 19th century that you're discussing, but also thinking about power and politics and this concentration of power, because I think this is a real defining problem that we're seeing right now when it comes to thinking about tech, which is this huge concentration of power in the hands of very few monopolistic tech companies. And often I think they are exploiting a kind of long-termist argument, this idea of AI in the long term is going to be good, it's going to help us create better societies, and it's going to somehow magically remove all these big structural problems. And these are claims that I would call techno-solutionist, or kind of trying to slap on a technical solution to something which is a much deeper and more embedded social and political problem. So, we see that kind of exploitation of that narrative to justify that concentration of power and this need for unfettered growth. But we also see a lot of other kinds, I think, of nefarious ways that these companies are drawing together different kinds of racial and gendered narratives in order to further concentrate their power and avoid their monopolies being, say, broken down by regulatory bodies. So like one rhetoric that I look at a lot is the narrative of an AI arms race between the US and China, and how that narrative is exploited by tech companies to encourage, say, the US government to see AI policy as industrial policy. And I'm drawing here very heavily off the work of the AI Now Institute, where Amar Kak and Sarah Myers-West have been doing a lot of research into this in order to try and hold some of these companies accountable. But yeah, I digress. I mean, I think the point on feminist ethics and AI, this is kind of my jam. So as Zoe kindly mentioned, we've got a book coming out in April. Or is it? No, in February, because we've got a book coming out in February called The Good Robot, which is all 2,000-word essays by feminist thinkers with lots of cool science fiction illustrations, so highly recommend. And we just had a book out this month called Feminist AI, Critical Perspectives on Algorithms, Data, and Intelligent Machines. And a lot of what feminist work, I think, is doing in this area is both probing the kinds of pasts we've had with technology, to reflect on your point at the beginning, Dan, around past and futures. So thinking about how do legacies of inequality play out within contemporary tech development, but also trying to think about different futures with technology, and also how those different futures could be informed by alternative paths. So I have a fantastic colleague here, Apeline, who wrote a chapter in our book, which looks at the history of feminist programming languages. Dan and I have a colleague, Isabella Rosner, who works on needlework, and we have a podcast episode coming out with her, which talks about what happens if we reimagine a lot of practices that are seen as being low tech, like usually women's work that's very gendered. So things like knitting, sewing, weaving, and being like, these are actually super high tech practices. We can understand knitting patterns as coding languages themselves. And they've also been really influential in the history of technology. So a lot of feminist work, I think, is in this area is very imaginative. Like, of course, it's very critical of power. Incredible work by data feminists like Lauren Klein and Catherine D'Ignazio, who are challenging the way that masculinist ideas and biases have shaped things from the history of data visualization to AI and machine learning. But yeah, also work that is like very visionary, I think, and very beautiful. And so I think I really want to encourage people to embrace the wealth of feminist work on tech out there. Yeah.
Thank you, Kerry. I think one thing I would just like to pick up on, I think, is this idea of democracy. And one of the other things that we've looked a lot at over the recent years is this idea of being a good citizen. And I wondered whether you wanted to sort of speak a little bit about that and sort of what actual responsibility us as individuals, as that sort of slightly boring phrase of the person on the street, the sort of person just living their lives, when all these big things are happening down, like you sort of said, this idea that there's this new idea now really that's sort of getting quite common, is that climate change now is unfixable. We're just going to have to live with it, and that the moment has passed. And that kind of idea that maybe we're shifting to a slightly more pessimistic view of the future as a society at the moment. And I wondered if you want to talk maybe a little bit about that idea of actually being a good citizen, and how we could inspire, let's say, our colleague, our neighbour, to sort of think about long-termism in that positive way.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. I think it's very interesting. So you talk about the climate debate and what Michael Eman calls doomism. This kind of doomist idea has become quite prevalent on the left, but mostly the right. That there's nothing that we can really do. Social collapse is inevitable. Would that be the kind of the doomist, slightly apocalyptic leftist argument? So in a sense, we've got to kind of run for the hills, in a literal somewhere on higher ground. But also, it's kind of concerning actually the ways in which environmental politics or green politics, which has been taken up on the right as something as a way of kind of saying, well, watch out, this is nanny state liberals, who want to kind of take away your car and your boiler. They want to force you to eat corn every day, uncooked. They present this idea that this is it's almost like a social class issue, and that it's trying to screw over working people in a cost of living crisis. I think all of this is quite concerning. And the thing that I'll come back to when we think about the role of what citizens can do, I think a prevailing feeling, narrative, not just in the UK, is a sense that there's not much that we can really do about politics or society. Everything is kind of just drifting. Everything is going to the dogs. I mean, that's a kind of an English malady kind of narrative. But everything is going to the dogs, and so the politicians are all as bad as each other. Society's going to collapse anyway. So in the meantime, I might as well just kind of withdraw into my own kind of small individual or kind of family bubble and not really make any effort to sort of intervene or contribute to politics. And where I'll challenge that, because I don't want it to be too gloomy, it's a gloomy moment, is a line from George Orwell's 1984, which I promise I'll fit into this idea of citizenship, which is he who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past. And I think when we're going back to the long-termism, the pessimism about the future, which often is coming by kind of nostalgia, actually, about the past. Within all of this, the thing that's missing, I think, it's even missing in William McCaskill's work, is the question of power and politics and our agency or actions in the present. And by kind of falling back on a fatalist narrative, it kind of conveniently suits the big monopolists that Kerry was talking about, Elon Musk and others, who are quite content for us to be fatalistic and kind of doom scrolling late at night on X, formerly known as Twitter, because it serves the economies of the time, but it doesn't necessarily serve us. It doesn't, whatever way we view politics, whether we view it in terms of, being a grandchild or having children or whatever framing we use, we mustn't lose track that our actions do have some consequence, and that matters. We're not giants who can control everything. We're not Prometheus, but we do have some responsibility, and I think moral responsibility, that's where I'd bring it back to. So yeah.
Actually, I wanted to ask you about kind of what you were saying about McCaskill and the idea of like long-termism as a particular sort of key moral priority. So, and you emphasize that a priority, not the priority, very much. So what would you say then to you, I do think, are the kind of other complementary priorities? Like what other things morally do you think actually this really needs to be something that we're focusing on collectively in order to be good citizens or in order to build, the kind of world that we want to live in?
I mean, Kerry, that's a brilliant question. It's a completely random quote. It's a really random quote. But I was thinking about our panel this morning when I was walking the dog, and I had Marvin Gaye came into my mind. What's going on? Rockets, moonshots, spend it all on have-nots. And let me use that line as a way of kind of thinking about other key moral priorities. Rather than so what's going on? Once that's 1970s. Early 70s. Back then, there was another kind of space race. It says of technology out of control. And Marvin Gaye's moral critique, I think, view it like that. That's how I view it. Is that how can societies talk about investing billions and billions into some technology that will only potentially benefit a few people? Well, in practice, it's probably benefited all of us in terms of GPS and everything. But look at it from his perspective. It benefits few people in societies in which you have mass hunger, deprivation, and misery everywhere. Why don't you spend it all on have-nots? Now, what I think that my kind of worry about long-termism, that's why I wanted to bring in the past, not just the future, is that it's a way of kind of assuming that the work is done in the present. That present that we don't, that the present day problems are other issues, or the risk, and this falls back to the previous long-termists of the 19th century or the 17th century, which is that those who have kind of failed, the have-nots, have kind of failed through a lack of effort or a kind of a lack of good planning or a lack of good free will or what have you. And for me, that bringing all these different pieces together, I would kind of call the advantage of thinking in the long term for me is that it gives us a sense of hope, and that it's worth acting in the present to deal with the issues that we're surrounded with now. And I know there's been such immense social progress in the last 50 years. But we have, thinking about the impacts of COVID, even on young people. Let's just give that as one example. A real crisis around mental health that I see it in many different places, in many different corners. A crisis of emotional well-being, and these are things that we can and should act on. I think in some ways AI could be it could usefully contribute to some of these challenges. I know some people use ChatGPT 4. It's been kind of as a kind of therapist, although you're not allowed to use it as that now. But some of these technologies have immense possibility, but they've got to be harnessed back to kind of present needs, and that involves having conversations about what matters to us. And that's why I think it comes back to morality, because there are so many different things. We could, Joseph Rowley Foundation this week, I think 4 million people in the UK destitute, kind of shocking figures about destitution in the UK. We can't solve every social problem at once, but we need to have a debate around what we can act upon. And I think that's missing actually in UK politics. We're drifting into a Labour landslide, which if you're a Labour Party member is fantastic. And if you hate the Tories, which many of us do, then that's also fantastic. But there isn't anything on the menu at the moment about social change and about meeting social challenges. And I think that's concerning. So Kerry, in answer to your question, I think it's going back to the present needs. I don't know, how would you approach it? It's such a hard question, so you've got to answer it too.
No, I mean, I really like what you're saying, especially at the end about this idea of like, where are we really going? And like, are we going to be bringing about the sort of transformational changes in sort of present and future society that we really, really need? And I think, this is certainly my concern when people say, oh, well, AI is going to magically fix certain things. And I'm not disagreeing at all with your point that AI can have hugely positive applications, but more just like when there's kind of this general proclamation that somehow we're not going to deal with different kinds of problems because we can throw technology at it. This really, really concerns me because, I think all of these technological questions are deeply political ones. And I was just thinking about what you were saying about how morality and politics are inseparable. And I would also argue that technology and politics are inseparable in a way. Take the idea of, say, creating like a synthetic data set. So this is often put forward as a solution to biased data sets. So the idea of like, well, the historical forms of prejudice that are deeply baked into our societies are similarly baked into our data sets. And that means the algorithms we train on them produced discriminatory and biased results. So why don't we create a new data set, a representative one that can help us create algorithms that will create fair results and they will make a better future, which is a great impulse and it sounds great. But the problem is that what is a representative data set? What is a good data set? What is a fair data set? Like that is not a technical question. That's not about just replicating the world as it stands and saying, great, now everything that's going to be produced from this is going to be good and fair and work well for us. Like that's a really deeply political question. And so I agree with you, Dan. Like I think that huge conversation around like what matters for us, what kinds of social change are needed, has to be at the heart and has to be a key moral priority for us. I don't really know how I can capture that in one word. I feel like that was a very unfair question for me to be like, I guess justice is one way that I would think about it a lot in my work. So I would see justice as being much more expansive than say fairness, or kind of the opposite of bias, which is often how these problems are approached in sort of technological settings. Sort of kind of more profoundly thinking about technology by and for the people who experience it. And I guess on that note of justice, I want to come back to your question, Zoe, around being a good citizen, which is, I think this kind of techno-pessimism we see makes sense because a lot of technology does happen to us, and that can feel very unfair. I'm very happy to be talking with you on Zoom, but I feel like we all had a moment in 2020 where Zoom and Teams emerged upon us and we sort of just had to learn how to use it. And as the journalist Kashmir Hill, I think kind of shows us really well, fully opting out of technological systems is super difficult, right? In order to live in the modern world. Like it really is like you have to be really, really profoundly disconnected in a place like the UK to sort of not have these tech systems put upon you in some way. But at the same time, we're also still active consumers of technologies. And so something I like to often ask people as something to go away with, like a little nub to chew over, is what does it mean to be a conscious consumer of technology? Because this is a conversation which is absolutely obviously not the solution to the huge amounts of environmental degradation we see. But I think this is an understanding that has started to grow amongst people, which is that actually what I purchase, what I do, does have an environmental impact. So how do I manage that? How do I think about that? And I think we need to have the same conversation about our technologies. I'm not proud to say I was like a super avid Twitter user and I loved following like very niche Twitter scandals, right? And I was that person who was like really invested in something that really probably didn't matter. And something that really challenged me was engaging with work like Cathy O'Neill's The Shame Machine and other work on social media saying like, this is how they profit. Like this is central to what it means for a social media platform to make money. I see it in my own social media productions now on TikTok. My videos that do the best when I do public engagement about AI are the ones either where I get harassed or where I say something controversial, or when I do a video on Star Trek, because Star Trek fans are like weirdly mean, which surprised me because I was like, I thought this was like the liberal sci-fi, but I digress. But I think for me, part of being a conscious consumer was saying, actually, if I'm serious about this whole tech ethics thing and feminist ethics, and like I need to think a little bit about how I use social media or how you use, technologies like ChatGPT. These have a huge environmental cost. I think a 20-minute conversation with ChatGPT is about the equivalent of pouring like a 500 milliliter bottle of water on the ground. I think that's something that people maybe just don't think about when they use ChatGPT. And I'm saying that doesn't mean you should never use it, but what does that mean if we're thinking about using these technologies consciously? And again, I don't want to say like, oh, the problem is the individual and like make it all about like, you have to do better. Because again, there's huge structural inequalities. But I also think if people want to do something, there are things they can do.
Well, I think I'm going to commend both of you for being pessimistic, but also optimistic at the same time. I think, and I think, to be honest, that's very reflective of how we generally all feel about sort of things like AI, politics, sort of democratic process. I think all of us sort of generally feel pessimistic, but undeniably optimism sort of always wins through. And I think maybe that's the reflection on the human condition, is that we just can't help but be hopeful for sort of collective futures, which I suppose is the sort of, while the sort of human wheel continues to turn, that we just can't quite give up on each other just yet. I'm really sorry. We've actually run out of time. This has been, I feel like it's a shame we can't be in a room together, because I would probably having to be dragging you both off stage, and you'd probably continue this conversation in a green room or in a bar. So I do hope that might happen in real life one day soon. Just a reminder to everybody, we'll include some links, and I've been trying to make notes of all the excellent books you've been mentioning along the way. So we will try and include some information about that in the description. But just thank you very much, Kerry and Dan, for joining me today. And I think all of our watchers and listeners will be most delighted to have got this chance to listen to you talk to each other.
Great, thank you, Zoe. Thank you everyone for listening, watching at home.
Yeah, thank you so much. And feel free to reach out to any of us as well if you have more questions, or if you're just really interested in these topics. We do really love to continue these conversations.
I suppose I'll add at that point that part of the New Generation Thinkers is that you are going to be out and about, and I think you'll be appearing on various programs, and I'm hoping at various events throughout the year, throughout next year even, so people can look out for you, and I can imagine they can sort of find out about you from websites and social media and stuff like that. Brilliant. Thank you again, Kerry and Dan.